Okay, so we're going to continue our charting the course of history of psychology with talking about the origins of psychoanalysis. And let's just get this party started. So when we think of psychoanalysis, the person that should come to mind is Sigmund Freud. And the effect that Sigmund Freud had on the development of psychotherapy and the impact that Freud had cannot be fully stated in this lecture. However, just to give you some ideas of who he was, psychoanalysis and Freud became a household name around the world. There continues to be even today, psychoanalytic centers throughout the world, including places like Japan, China, Argentina, and many European countries. So he was world famous in his day, and he remains to be a legend in the field of psychotherapy even today. To give you even more of an idea of who he is and, you know, the appreciation that the general public had for him, he was on the cover of Time magazine on 3 separate occasions. That is quite a feat. He is a pivotal person in the history of civilization, and he helped us conceptualize how we view ourselves. So, 3 shocks to humanity. So if you were going to look at 3 major earth-shattering changes in the way we view the world, you start with Copernicus, who said the earth is not the center of the universe, rather the sun is. That's revolutionary. Charles Darwin says humans are not distinctive species, and as we learned earlier in a previous lesson, there is a continuum between the non-human animal and the human animal. And there's a relationship between the two. And then there was Freud. And Freud changed the way we view the mind. And Freud said that there were unconscious forces that govern our life. And this is revolutionary because sometimes people might behave in a certain way that doesn't make much sense to us. It isn't necessarily rational thought, but something beneath the surface drives that individual to behave in a certain way. So, in terms of schools of thought, in 1895, you had many of the major players we've talked about. Wundt was still alive. He was 63 years old, still teaching the next generation. You had Titchener, who's 28 years old, and Watson, who's in adolescence starting to form his view of the mind. So Wundt and Titchener are responsible for structuralism. Watson is responsible for behaviorism. And then you have functionalism starting to thrive and create the US spirit of psychology. So the Jamesian approach. By 1939, which was Freud's death, Wundt's psychology, structuralism, and functionalism get overtaken by behaviorism. So now you have 2 competing forces, psychoanalytic approaches and behavioristic approaches, and the other schools of thought fade away. So if we were to compare psychoanalysis with previous schools of thought. Other schools had a shared academic heritage. Most people went to Germany to learn under Wilhelm Wundt as they crafted their ideas. The research concepts were formulated and refined in laboratories, lecture halls, and libraries. Sensation perception are key to learning, and you have an emphasis on psychology as a pure science. Whereas psychoanalytic worldview tries to distinguish itself from other schools of thought. And it didn't necessarily view itself as much as a pure science as behaviorism. It comes out of medicine and psychiatry with a focus on abnormal behavior, and the laboratory were hospitals and clinics. So the primary method of research was clinical observation rather than your true experimental method. And rather than trying to deal with overt behavior, that which you can see, they try and dig beneath the surface and try and understand what makes you tick. So psychoanalysis deals with the unconscious at this point. So the idea of unconscious forces driving your behavior were not well received from Wundt and Titchener because they couldn't be studied through introspection. They couldn't be broken down to their sensory elements like Titchener wanted. Functionalists discarded it. William James acknowledged the concept of unconscious forces, but eventually people like Angel and Woodworth only addressed unconscious forces sort of after the fact. Sort of, if you look at Angel's text, 2 pages on it, Woodworth only addressed it as a postscript, not in the body of his work. And Watson, the biggest antagonist of psychoanalysis, said there's no use for the study of the unconscious or consciousness. Rather, we should be focusing on environmental triggers and behavioral outputs. So, what does Freud do? Freud is a trailblazer in his own right because he brings the unconscious to psychology. Now, Freud did not necessarily come up with these ideas on his own. It's very important to understand that there were other individuals who had very similar ideas that Freud likely profited from. For example, Leibniz, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, which most people know in the sense of being the co-creator of calculus, also talked about this concept of monadology, which are these atoms of the mind. And in terms of our perception, our experience, there are a bunch of monads, mental elements that bind together and break through to the surface. And that's how we have experiences. But many of these monads happen beneath the surface. It's only through their interaction with one another, when they're grouped together, that you get an expansion. So when we talk about mental events, Leibniz refers to these as the activity of monads, and they could range from completely unconscious to completely conscious. So the completely unconscious are singular monads that are happening beneath the surface. So you have these single drops that you cannot recognize. right? So they're what we call petite perceptions, or smaller amounts of consciousness, right? So it's hard to break it down to its part. Now, if you were to see this and you were to look at an ocean, a petite perception, or things of the monads, are like a single bead of water, a single drop of water. Now that in of itself, it doesn't have any strength, and it's hardly recognizable. But when you put a bunch of these petite perceptions together, you get something called apperception, which is conscious realization. So that would be more analogous to the whole wave. So the petite perception would be a singular drop, largely out of conscious awareness. And then you have apperception when these monads come together, or a conscious realization of petite perceptions, more analogous to the whole wave. Then you have Johann Friedrich Herbart, and he introduces the concept of a limen, or threshold. Now, most of you are aware of the term limen, even though it doesn't sound familiar, because you might have heard the term subliminal messaging, right? And there's an argument that in advertisement there's subliminal messaging. So when you have subliminal, these are below the threshold, or unconscious ideas. Now, according to Herbart, it's the compatible ideas that bind together and break through to conscious experience. Those incompatible ideas, those unacceptable ideas, get pushed beneath the surface, and they can only break through when enough incompatible ideas join together and knock off a compatible idea. So when we talk about taboos tend to lie beneath the surface because they're incompatible with that which is acceptable. But there are times when the taboos break through, and then you have a conscious experience of a taboo. So that's the subliminal experience. Then you have the supraliminal experience, which is above threshold, or conscious ideas. These result in consciousness, and that occurs through apperception, which is something we talked about with Wundt already and earlier in this lesson. Then you have Fechner, right? So Fechner talks about the concept of thresholds, but he's the first person to describe the mind similar to an iceberg. And similar to an iceberg, Fechner says most of the mind is in the unconscious, and only the tip of the iceberg is seen, right? So our thoughts, according to Fechner, are often influenced by unobservable forces. How about psychopathology? So if you were to look at psychopathology, there's a history. And the purpose of going through this fast history, which you might have learned in abnormal psychology, is to show you what Freud was revolting against. There are three major models of mental illness. There is a supernatural model, there's a medical model, and then there's a psychogenic model. And we're going to go through it. When we go 2,000 years before the Common Era, the mental illness was explained by possession of demons. And the way to treat mental illness 4,000 years ago was through magic and prayer. Fast forward to Greek philosophers, they argued that mental illness occurred through disorganized thought processes. So you treated mental illness through pervasive speech and healing words. Moved to Christianity 2,000 years ago. There was a belief that mental illness was caused by possession of evil spirits. And the treatment for mental illness oftentimes was fairly barbaric. And so you might have a gentle approach to treatment, things like an exorcism to coax the evil spirit out, according to Christian doctrine. But if the spirit did not come out, there was a process called trephination. So if you look at the top picture on the right with those two holes in the skull, what people would do is they would take a hand drill and drill a hole in the skull. And the belief was that that would create an opening for the evil spirit to leave. Unfortunately, many of these individuals were severely harmed, and many of them wound up dead. Moving even forward to the 1400s through the 1700s, we're talking about the time of the Inquisition. And there was a lot of emphasis on looking for heresy and witchcraft. And the belief was that witchcraft was responsible for symptoms of mental illness. And there were tests to determine whether a person was a witch. What you're looking at in the bottom right are the Salem witch trials, or where they would see if a witch could float. And if she floated, she was put to, or that's a Freudian slip, let me correct that. They would see if a person could float. If they floated, they were deemed to be a witch, and then they were put to death. But if they didn't float and they drowned, then they deemed you not to be a witch. So it's kind of a catch-22. Either way, the person was put to death. By the 1700s, mental illness was described as caused by irrational behavior. Now, by the 1700s, people were no longer put to death for mental illness. They were no longer accused of sorcery or witchcraft, but they were institutionalized. And the institutions were not humane, right? Many times they were shackled against the walls, put in cages. They sometimes were treated as a tourist attraction, like in the Bethlehem Hospital in London, where you could pay a token amount of money to hear the screams of the individuals with mental illness. So in the 1700s, institutionalization was large. Well, along comes other individuals. A Spanish scholar argued that when you treat individuals humanely and with sensitivity and with care, that helps. Now, the problem is, despite what's happening in America and what's happening in England and France and all of these European nations where there's largely torture, the message of humane treatment and Juan Luis Vives, his work was not received because the dominant language of science in those days were either German or English. So linguistic barriers interfere with effective treatment. But along comes Philippe Pinel. Now, Philippe Pinel is considered a hero in the history of psychology. He was responsible for unshackling the mentally ill. So he argued that mental illness occurred through biological processes and should be treated through natural sciences. So the idea of locking people away, chaining them away, was not no longer considered appropriate for treatment. So he was responsible for changing the course of treatment in his day. And so he freed patients from their chains. he paid attention to their problems. Now, what's interesting is that even today we do charting, treatment plans, session notes. All of these things are responsible to help us keep a record of the problems. He had detailed case histories. And what he found was that with humane treatment, people got better, people got healthier, people were able to return to regular society. So Philippe Pinel is considered a hero, and here is just an artistic rendition of Philippe Pinel and the role he played in unshackling the mentally ill. Now, these changes spread through Europe and the United States. So many individuals were removed. The chains were removed from patients, and then mental illness became a popular research interest. Now, people started to take a mechanistic approach, like we learned earlier in the semester. And patients were now viewed like machines that needed to be repaired. And there's this movement towards finding the right tools to repair the mentally ill. Another key figure in working towards humane treatment for individuals with mental illness is Dorothea Dix. Now, she worked very hard to implement Philippe Pinel's system in the United States. She testified before Congress, very religious, and described herself as an advocate for the mentally ill. And she even testified, as I said, before Congress, and changed the way we treated the mentally ill. And there went from this barbaric treatment, this chaining people, to a state regulation, and state hospitals were born. And in the time of Dorothea Dix, state hospitals were a good thing because they were supervised and regulated. And we'll talk about the regression as we go forward. Another key player is Benjamin Rush. Benjamin Rush is the first US psychiatrist. Random point of interest, he was a signer on the Declaration of Independence, and he created the first psychiatric hospital. Now, he argued, again, for a biological approach, that mental illness was equivalent to irrational behaviors that occur due to either excess or insufficient blood flow. So he suggested that you should engage in bloodletting or blood infusions. He had a rotating chair to get a blood rush to the brain. He had shock treatment in terms of putting people in ice water, and then he had a tranquilizing technique where he restrained people in a chair and put pressure and applied it to the head with a wooden block, as you see on the right side. Now, if you were to ask me, were any of these methods effective? The answer is no. But it's an interesting point. You can make history for other reasons, right? To create a psychiatric hospital and to explore mental illness and try and treat it in a natural way, that was big. Now, moving forward, we have Franz Anton Mesmer, who is from Vienna, and he tended to use hypnosis as a form of treatment. So he used hypnotherapy and magnetism. And he felt that if he were to pass magnets over the body, he could repolarize the body and ultimately redistribute these magnetic fields and treat mental illness. And Franz Anton Mesmer, in his day, was a celebrity, and he made a lot of money going to the aristocrats of the day and banquets, and he would do these treatments. And the highlight would be when he passed these magnets over a person, sometimes the individual would faint, and that would draw a lot of attention to the strength of his cure. Now, the reality is that it was a fraud. So here's how it goes. He starts practicing in Vienna, eventually switches over from magnets to other objects that didn't have electrical polarity. So he came to believe that it wasn't the magnets, ultimately it was his healing hands. So he went to France, became famous. He put his patients in a trance, made a lot of money off of this, but eventually he was run out of town because he was viewed as a charlatan or a fraud, where he fled to Switzerland. Now, by the way, he did this in many places. He bounced around a bit. Then you have James Braid, who's responsible for neurohypnology, which is the early term for hypnosis. And he did research on hypnosis, which was a trance-like condition. And he tried to demonstrate hypnosis was effective, but he wanted to be very, very careful about his claims. So he's very detailed, meticulous in how he collected data. He was harshly critical of anyone who overstated their claims on hypnosis. And ultimately, the impact of James Braid was that it inspired greater respect for the study of hypnosis and credibility. So along comes Jean-Martin Charcot, which is a French physician, and he started to treat those individuals with psychosis or insane women in Paris. And he tried to use hypnosis to treat hysteria. Now, his work was largely neurological, not psychological. And that's an important point because many of the early psychoanalysts were medical doctors, including Freud, right? Jean-Martin Charcot was looking for neurological factors. And Pierre Janet, which was one of Charcot's students, he argued that hysteria, which Charcot wanted to focus on the neurological condition, which was biological or somatic, he argued that hysteria was psychological. And Pierre Janet used hypnosis to treat hysteria and largely was a key influencer on Sigmund Freud. Now we also have Darwin, right? Darwin had a key influence on Freud. Darwin said we had unconscious mental processes, and there's mental conflict. Darwin believed in the importance of studying dreams and the importance of sexual arousal and drives like love and hunger, and he studied emotions and development. All of these factors are happening at the same time as Freud is gaining prominence. Now that brings us to Freud. So if we're keeping score, I said there were 3 ways to treat mental illness. There was a supernatural approach, which the treatments were largely ineffective or harmful to the person. There was the biological or medical approach, which didn't fully capture things like the treatments of Benjamin Rush. And then you had the psychogenic or the mentalistic approach, which we talked about individuals like Mesmer and Charcot and Janet, right? So let's talk about Freud because he's the central figure. in this lesson. So Sigmund Freud was born in Freiburg, Moravia, and his family moved to Vienna when they were 4. He was treated as the golden child by his family. The family was quite large, but all the money went towards Freud. So if the family had extra money, it went to Freud's piano lessons or his scholarship. So he received preferential treatment over his sisters, and he did fairly well in school. Now, we're going to see that with psychoanalytic thought, many of the theories are influenced by the personal experience of the theorist. Now, you might wonder, how did Freud come up with the Oedipus complex, which was that a person would have a fear for their father, attraction towards their mother, and so there'd be a rivalrous relationship towards the father and emotional bond towards the mother or sexual attraction. Well, if we look at his life, it might tell a story. Freud's father was authoritarian, very, very rigid, very demanding. Freud's father was 20 years older than his mother, and Freud tended to both love and fear his dad, whereas his mother tended to be much more nurturing and warm, and Freud developed a strong emotional bond and attachment towards his mother, where she became proud of him. So the fear of his dad and the bond with his mother might explain partially how he comes up with the Oedipus complex. Naturally, this is part of Greek mythology as well, but he brings it into his theory of personality. During his university years, 1873, he starts studying medicine at the University of Vienna. It took about 8 years to complete his degree, and that's partially because, in addition to doing his medical degree, he took coursework outside of his degree, such as philosophy. And what's interesting is that this foundation of philosophy helps him develop many of these theories. He shifts his focus, starts doing research on biology, started looking at eel testicle morphology, didn't find anything meaningful in his research. So he switched over to physiology and started studying the spinal cord in fish and spent 6 years working on that. At that point, he starts doing research on cocaine, and cocaine was his major treatise at the time, and he argued that cocaine was a wonder drug. He published a treatise called Uber Coca, which promoted the use of cocaine. And what's important to understand was that cocaine was not illegal at that time. Freud used cocaine, his friends used cocaine, his patients used cocaine, and he found that it helped cure his depression and indigestion. And that should not come as a shock because it's a stimulant, so it's an upper. He used this drug to his middle ages, and ultimately Kohler learned about the effects of cocaine from Freud and uses this to anesthetize the eye during surgery. Now, what I will tell you is that he changes his point of view on cocaine when one of his better friends gets hooked on it and overdoses. So he doesn't maintain that playset throughout. In 1881, he earns his medical degree and starts practicing as a neurologist. Didn't like the work, but it paid money. He eventually finds his wife, Martha Bernays, but he struggled paying for the wedding because of financial challenges. Eventually, he does get married 4 years later, but in order to pay for the wedding, he has to pawn some of his belongings and borrow money. Now, one of the major aspects of Freud's work is on hysteria. And another key player when we talked about Charcot and Genet was Breuer. Breuer did a lot of research. He was interested in neurology-based research, semicircular canal, and he understood balance and whatnot. But Breuer becomes a mentor and a friend for Freud, and he starts to talk about Anna O as a patient. Now, Anna O, her real name was Bertha Pappenheim. She was highly intelligent, 21-year-old female, had hysteria. Now, hysteria would likely be described today as conversion disorder, which is more or less some kind of physical impairment without an actual physical cause. So she was crucial in helping develop an understanding of hysteria, and this case was crucial in developing psychoanalysis. So Breuer starts working with hypnosis, and when Anna talked about her symptoms, they disappeared. What's interesting with this process is that talking about it would shift in some patients. She would shift symptoms elsewhere. So putting a spotlight on the symptoms actually made them disappear. So Anna called this the talking cure or chimney sweeping, which helped Anna O. Now, in addition to helping her with hysteria, Anna O discovered that she also reported other taboo or repulsive acts under hypnosis. So this becomes the basis of the unconscious, right? Now, there was a positive transference towards Breuer. So we tended to see transferences when the client, or in this case, the patient, projects feelings onto the therapist. Now, in this case, Anna O developed feelings feelings of love towards Breuer, and that creates a sense of jealousy with Breuer's wife, and ultimately they terminated therapy. Now, was Anna O cured by Breuer? The answer is no. Right? She ultimately becomes institutionalized, becomes addicted to morphine, and spends a lot of time obsessing over her father's picture. Now, without the help of Breuer, she eventually overcomes these emotional problems, becomes a social worker, and starts advocating for women's rights, and was honored with a picture of her on a postage stamp. Now, all you need to know about the story of Anna O was how talk therapy worked. And there appeared to be a catharsis or a healing effect through talk therapy. Whether it was hypnosis or something else, Freud said, well, maybe talking to people, we can get to the root of their mental problems. So Breuer and Freud write studies on hysteria, which becomes the foundation of psychoanalysis. Pay attention to the date, 1895. That's the same date we talked about earlier in the lecture. And so what they established psychoanalysis, they talked about hysteria, they demonstrated, shared their notes and case histories by both of them. Now, what was interesting is that Breuer didn't necessarily want to publish at first, but Freud was afraid that someone would beat him to the punch. So they ultimately do publish. Now, Breuer also was critical of Freud's emphasis on sex, and sex being the root of neurosis. But nevertheless, the book was well received. People bought it, it sold out. And now here we go. We start to try and explore what's happening beneath the surface. So now the attempt to try and understand the unconscious. So if the unconscious is the vast majority of who you are, vast majority of personality, then the emphasis should be studying the unconscious. So Freud tried to study the unconscious in many different ways. So he tried hypnosis, but he wasn't all that great. And he found that some patients did better than others. And ultimately, he came to this idea of just talking, say whatever comes to mind, and that would help. So this idea of free association was the biggest gift that came out of this. And Freud felt that if you give a person enough time to talk, things that are lurking beneath the surface will come up to the surface. And those repressed memories or repressed experiences could be worked on. So as they come to the surface, you could identify the root of abnormal behavior, and you could get a catharsis or a healing effect. So free association material, again, he did not believe that free association was random. Now here's just a picture of the couch that he would have people lay on in Vienna. He did not look at them, so he would sit in a chair and they would not look him in the eyes because he felt that that would force them to filter. So he just had them look away and continue talking. And it allowed him to tap into what was consciously censored or some kind of challenge. And what he found was that sex was at the root of many causes of neurosis. All right. So let's talk about sex and Freud's view on sex. Freud believed that sex was one of the roots of neurosis. He tended to have a negative perspective on it. He viewed sex as animalistic. He had his own sexual difficulties. And then eventually by 41, he gives up sex for a while. And then he argues that he sublimated it and put all his energy into his work. And then, so then eventually he blamed his wife, said, no, I don't want to get you pregnant. And the only reason why one should have sex is for procreation. Very antiquated ideas, but in his day, those were received. Eventually, he diagnosed himself with neurasthenia, which is OCD-like attitudes, and tried to understand what that was about. So he looked into his dreams. So hypnosis didn't work. Free association worked. And then another way to tap into the unconscious were dreams. And according to Freud, dreams were the royal road to the unconscious. And every morning, Freud wrote in his journal about the dreams he had for 2 years, and he identified certain themes. So he identified hostility towards his dad, attraction towards his mother as a child, and then sexual urges towards his oldest sister. In the end, he puts it all together. 1900, writes a book called The Interpretation of Dreams, which was one of his major works. And as part of this, he highlights the Oedipus complex, and he gets a student out of this in Carl Jung. And we'll talk about Carl Jung in our next lesson. But after reading this, Carl Jung started psychoanalysis and becomes a student of Freud. Then in 1901, he adds the concept called a parapraxis, which is a Freudian slip. And then he started to have discussion groups. He called it the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society, where he would have his students come to his house and have weekly case consultation. This included Carl Jung, Alfred Adler, and then in terms of Freud, he didn't support disagreement that well. So if a person disagreed with him, as Carl Jung and Alfred Adler did, eventually they were bounced on their head and they were expelled from the group. So we'll talk more about that next lesson, but that is part of it. Now, in 1905, he writes 3 essays on the theory of sexuality. By 1909, he was a sensation. We talked about Clark University. He was invited to speak with Jung, and his lectures become published in American Journal of Psychology. And then by 1911, the American Psychoanalytic Association was founded. Now, this is important. The American Psychoanalytic Association is still here to this very day. But what it highlights is the effect of Freud's ideas starting to spread from Vienna to the United States, right? Because that's going to become big. Many of his students come over to the United States as well. So what happens in the end is fights break out, disagreements break out. Freud breaks with Adler, Freud breaks with Jung. They formulate their own ideas, such as the collective unconscious and individual psychology. And they formulate their own schools of thought, which we'll talk about. Now, by 1923, Freud has throat cancer. He was a very big smoker, smoked a lot of cigars, and in 16 years between being diagnosed and dying, he had 33 surgeries. Now, what's interesting is that Freud was Jewish, and he was in Vienna. And at that time, the Nazis were not all that welcoming of Jews or Jewish ideas, but Freud was considered a celebrity. So what's interesting is that Freud bribed the Nazis to allow him and his daughter to flee to London. And that's interesting because many other Jews of the day didn't get that treatment. He only got that because of his celebrity status and the respect that he had in the community. But that didn't stop them from burning his books and, making a statement that psychoanalysis was a dirty Jewish science of sorts. 1939, he dies of an overdose of morphine by his doctor, which he was euthanized, basically. So now let's look at psychoanalysis in terms of treatment. Remember how we talked about free association or talk therapy? It's not always free. So psychotherapy was long-term. Psychoanalytic treatment was a long-term therapy, and it was quite expensive, right? So patients reached a point of either being unable or unwilling to continue, right? So, and Freud would call these resistance or blockages, and they were designed to protect you. But the idea of protecting yourself from this pain actually caused more pain. So it necessitated further probing. And as a function of these moments where you would get stuck, Freud introduced a concept called repression, which is where you push beneath the surface unacceptable ideas, memories, desires from the conscious to the unconscious. Now, what's our job as clinicians is to bring things back from the unconscious to the surface again. And in order to do that, there must be some sense of rapport and transference, positive transference. And we, as clinicians, reparent the child, so to speak. Now, dreams, again, dreams have two levels. As I said, they're royal road to the unconscious. You have the manifest content and a latent content. Manifest content was that which you remembered from the dream, and the latent content was the symbolism of the dream. So what it truly meant. And again, not all dreams were based on emotional conflict, but here's an example of some dream symbols and then their deeper latent interpretation. Now, you'll notice if you look at these symbols, Freud puts a strong emphasis on sexuality. Now, in terms of psychoanalysis, his goal was to explain the dynamics of human behavior, and he viewed techniques of association and dream analysis as tools for data collection, which was part of his research passion. Now, interesting to note, unlike traditional experimental psychology, his approach was without statistics. So a lot of the other members of the day, you remember Wundt and Titchener rejected it because it was more anecdotal. So he used free association, dream analysis, and case histories, which are qualitative data. And so he used case examples to support his theory in the absence of data. So as this goes on, his Freud system gets very large, complicated, many times contradictory. And Freud was the sole interpreter of the theory. So if there was any criticism, Freud said, well, this is what it is. And he presented his system as above reproach. And that actually set psychoanalysis back for quite some time, because there is some good research on the effectiveness of psychoanalysis, but Freud did not feel that quantitative research could truly capture it. So many people said psychoanalysis was his system and his system alone. So in terms of what Freud explored, he explored ignored areas, and this caught attention. So he focused on unconscious motivation, conflict between different drives, and the effect of these conflicts. So one thing he talks about is our instincts, and these are a mental representation of internal stimuli that motivate behavior and personality. Now, if you were to look at biological forces, you have an instinct, which is an innate drive in animals, and then you have a tribe, which is a human impulse, which was not fully inherited, but had some purpose. And then in terms of the basic drives, you have eros and thanatos. Eros is a life instinct that results from hunger, thirst, and sex. So the primary focus of eros is self-preservation and survival. And it's manifested through the libido, which was a large sex drive according to Freud, but his followers were more more generic in their definition of libido. But after World War I, now he didn't have a second drive until after World War I. And during World War I, he noticed that just like you have the capacity for life and life preservation, there was also the power for death and destruction. So he said there was another force called thanatos, which is a death instinct, which results in things like suicide, hatred, aggression. Now, interesting to note, this force, this destructive force, can be outwardly facing or inwardly facing. So you can self-harm in this way too. Now, similar to what we said with Fechner, Freud also said the mind was like an iceberg, mostly hidden. And he said there are three levels of personality: the conscious experience, that which is observable and you're completely aware of; the preconscious, which was outside of your awareness but was accessible; and then the unconscious, which was the larger surface, which happened beneath the surface. And these were your thoughts, wishes, desires, which were oftentimes taboo and you were unaware of. Now, as part of the personality structure, he says there are three parts of personality, and they are at odds with one another at all times. So you have the id, ego, and superego. The id, or S, stands for it. And this is your base drives, the most primitive part of personality, operating based on the pleasure principle. Things like I want it and I want it now. Then on the other side, you have the Uber-Ich, which is the above I, or what we translate as the superego, which is your conscience. So what's interesting about the id is that it is amoral or immoral, depending on who you ask. And then the superego is your moral compass. And they're constantly at odds with one another, and they pull you in different directions. And if you only had these two forces, you could lose your mind, right? So actually, I'll give you an example afterwards. But fortunately for us, we have a third force, and that third force is the ego. And the ego, the whole job, or I shouldn't say the whole job, one of the primary jobs of the ego is to satisfy the desires of the id without compromising the values of the superego. That's its job. So it's very practical, grounded in reality, and tries to serve it. So I'm not going to do the caveman analogy. I'll do a candy bar analogy. I want you to imagine that you're 5 years old now, and you go into a supermarket and you see your favorite candy. The id, but you have no money, by the way. The id sees the candy bar, and it's operating based on the pleasure principle, instant gratification, and is not bound by morality. So if you think about the id, what is the id going to tell you? Steal it. It's going to say, just take it. There are plenty more candy bars. No basis on morality, just pleasure. Take the candy bar because it tastes good. The superego is going to jump in and say, don't take it. It's illegal, immoral. You're going to get punished, all these different things. So now you have sort of like the little angel and devil on both of your shoulders saying, steal it, don't steal it, steal it, don't steal it. And the job of the ego is to jump in and say, hey, maybe there's another way you could get this, such as going home and asking your parent for money, or asking the shopkeeper, could you do something around the shop to earn that candy bar? This way, the id gets candy bar, so the pleasure principle is satisfied, but the superego doesn't feel threatened because you didn't violate any moral values. So here again, id, ego, superego, iceberg analogy, notice the massive part of personality beneath the surface. This is why Freud focused on the id, because he felt it was the largest part of personality. Now, if you look at this diagram, what's interesting is that the ego and superego cross the three levels of consciousness, whereas the id is entirely unconscious. Now, where does anxiety come from? According to Freud, anxiety occurs when the ego is threatened, and there are different kinds of anxiety. There's objective anxiety, which is what we all experience, and that's fine. But then there's neurotic and moral anxiety. Neurotic anxiety occurs from a fear of being punished for expressing one's its desires, or moral anxiety is a fear of guilt and shame around one's actions. So, fear of guilt or fear of punishment are the two factors here. Now, when we have anxiety, we also use something called defense mechanisms to help us cope. So, defense mechanisms allow us to temporarily distort reality to help us deal with the uncomfortable experience. Now, this is also part of the job of the ego. So, denial is a defense mechanism where you just say it's not true. So, an example of denial as a defense mechanism might be if a person did blood work and they find that they might have some kind of condition that is harmful to their health, the person might say, I want a second opinion. Well, most second opinions match the first opinion, but it's that partial denial to say, I can't believe it. Or if a person gets a bad grade on a report card, they say, it doesn't matter. Grades don't matter. When in reality, grades do matter, but it helps them not have to deal with the bad grade. Reaction formation is when you feel one way inside, but you do the exact opposite as you're interacting with another person. So let's say you had a neighbor you didn't like and you avoided them, but one day you got stuck in an elevator with them. You might say, hey, it's so good to see you, even though you don't feel that way at all. Displacement might be when people get angry or frustrated, that instead of addressing the root of their anger or frustration, they take out their anger out on a safe target, such as punching a pillow, fighting with a friend, or going home and picking a fight with a romantic partner. Repression and suppression, these are where things are forced from the conscious to the unconscious. The only difference between repression and suppression is repression occurs unconsciously. It's an automatic response, whereas suppression, there is a conscious effort to push it beneath the surface. For example, if a person was assaulted, one could be so affected by the assault that they black out and don't remember anything. That would be repression. Or the person could be so bothered by the assault that they know it happened, but they're like, I don't want to deal with this now. I'll deal with it later. That's suppression. So pushing it out of the way. Regression is to when one is anxious, retreat to a more infantile state. So that might be when a person gets goofy before a speech or something of that nature. Rationalization is to justify one's behavior. Compensation is where a person has one inadequacy, so they overcompensate in another area to be super good because they're afraid they couldn't perform in the other area. And here is just a picture of different defense mechanisms in a cartoon-esque stylistic way. So if you look at the picture, anxiety is sort of like an invading army and it's attacking you. So denial would be like if you were to pull up the drawbridge, the army disappears. It doesn't, right? Or reaction formation, the army is shooting arrows at the person and they're throwing back roses. Hey guys, let's not get upset. Or regression being more infantile, the king is sucking his thumb, crawling on the floor like a baby. And I could go through them all, but you get the idea. Now, we also talk about personality development. Sigmund Freud has the psychosexual stages of development where pleasure moves from one erogenous zone to another. And what happens, neurosis occurs when these early childhood experiences are not processed effectively and one develops a fixation. A fixation is an unresolved conflict in early childhood that affects you at a later point in time. So let's go through the psychosexual stages. The oral stage is from birth to 18 months, where pleasure surrounds the mouth. Now, when you think about this, what are we talking about here? The primary source of pleasure is feeding. So a child receives pleasure from nursing or bottle feeding, and eventually you have to wean the child off the breast or the bottle. And if you shift that, if you wean the child too quickly or don't wean the child, you can develop an oral fixation, which could result in nail biting, sucking one's thumb, cigarette smoking, excessive chewing, and so forth. An anal fixation, 18 to 36 months is when potty training occurs. So here, if you force a child into potty training too early or you don't, they could develop an anal fixation. So being anal retentive would be where a child refuses to relieve themselves at all. So they hold the bowels in. So everything, it's constrictive or restraining. So this could be where a person needs things to be exact or a certain way, things like OCD. The opposite, if the child is not potty trained, they could be anal expulsive, where they just let everything out. So this could be excessive messiness, disorganization, ADHD, and so forth. The phallic stage is from 3 to 6 years old. At the age of about 3, males and females start to recognize their genitalia and they recognize they're male or female. And one of the things that happens for boys is the Oedipus complex, which we talked about earlier, which was a desire for one's mother, a rivalrous relationship with one's father. But what's interesting is that, so even though the boy has an attraction towards his mother, he never acts on it because of the fear of castration. Castration anxiety is prominent. So instead of acting on his impulses, he emulates or identifies with his father in hopes to get a lover like his mother. The flip side is true for girls. There's the Electra complex, where girls are attracted to their father, rivalrous of their mother. And then girls have something called penis envy, which is a sense of jealousy of boys because they don't have a penis and they feel somehow inferior to men because men have a penis. Now, it's interesting, penis envy and castration anxiety are not supported ideas, but nevertheless, these were part of his theory. Stage 4 is latency. So this is about 6 years old to puberty. This is a calm between the storms. So here, this is school age, no pleasure, no conflict needs to be resolved. And then at adolescence, you hit the genital stage, which are capable of mature sexual relations, and that leads to adult-like responsibilities like love, work, and parenthood. Now, what are some of the contributions of Freud? Well, one major contribution is removing mental illness away from the supernatural. So he created emphasis on scientific exploration of personality. It wasn't evil spirits, it wasn't the devil, so things like that. Another contribution is he talked about sex and sexuality as motivational forces, which was revolutionary in his day because people did not talk as freely about sex or sexuality. Early childhood experience is key. He puts a strong emphasis on early childhood experience. So, if you had a trauma in early childhood, that could affect your personality development, and things like Freudian slips, dream analysis, and therapy were major contributions. Now, what are some of the limitations of his approach? Well, he really did his research in an unsystematic and uncontrolled environment. He put a hodgepodge of information back together based on his recollection. He destroyed most of his files, so you couldn't challenge it. And he focused more on qualitative work rather than statistical analyses, which is questionable. Also, his view on women, he viewed in the male superiority myth. And one of the manifestations was that somehow he felt that women were inferior because they didn't have a penis, therefore they had weaker superegos and body inferiority. One of his students, Karen Horney, which we'll talk about, flips the script and says males have womb envy, which is the counterpart, which is equally untrue. But Karen Horney was an early feminist and said, no, maybe males are jealous of women because they can bring forth life. And then in terms of contemporary analysts, what do they say? Freud's view on women is not proven. It's wrong. And there are a whole lot of social factors that play a role, such as the gender divide and sex-based discrimination. So, and that is our lesson for today. So I'll stop there.